Hi, this is iTTV. I'm Dr. Meena, your biology teacher. We are meeting back again to discuss the topic of transport, which is the first chapter in Biology Form 5. Now, in our lesson 2, we have covered the topic of transport, which dealt with medium, vessels and the pump. And in our lesson 3 and 4, we have covered on the topic of medium and vessels. Today, we're going to take a look at the pump, which is none other than the heart. My dear students, let us do a little exercise before we go on into today's lesson. I want you all to take your right hand and place your palm on a little bit on the left side of your chest. Now, a little gentle, please. Can you feel the vibration? Can you feel a vibration? Yes, that is your heartbeat. And today we are going to discuss nothing more than the heart and how the heart functions to propel the blood throughout your whole body. Today we're going to take a look at the human heart. The human heart is a myogenic pump, and we're going to take a deeper look. But before that, let us focus onto something which is written on the board. If you recall from our previous lessons, we have mentioned that the human circulatory system is a double closed circulation system. Now here we're going to see why it is called the double closed circulation system. The human heart has got two major circulation. One is the pulmonary system, whereby the blood is pumped from the heart to the lungs and back to the lungs. The heart pumps deoxygenated blood to the lungs, and the lungs return back the oxygenated blood to the heart. This is called as the pulmonary circulation system. And the next one is the systemic circulation system, where the blood from all parts of the body, the deoxygenated blood from all parts of the body, are pumped back into the heart, and the heart pumps it into the lungs to renew it, to get back the oxygenated blood, which is then pumped back to all parts of the body. So this is called as a systemic circulation. We have another word here which is not considered to be part of this double closed circulation system, but this is a very important circulation system whereby the heart itself is infused with blood by the coronary system. We have the coronary arteries and the coronary veins to supply the blood for the heart itself, for the functioning of the heart. Now let us take a look deeply into today's lesson, which is none other than the human heart. Let us take a look at the following diagram. The following diagram shows a real human heart and the location of the human heart in the middle of the thoracic cavity in between the lungs. Now that you have seen the picture of a real human heart and a diagrammatic description of the human heart, let us take a look at the characteristics and the features of the human heart. The human heart is a dark red cone-shaped muscular organ, and it is one of the three components of the circulatory system. As we recall it from our previous lessons, we have mentioned that the components of the circulatory system are none other than the vessels, medium and the pump. And today we are touching on the pump, which is the human heart. Back to the lesson. The human heart is made up of cardiac muscle, which is myogenic. Now the cardiac muscle is a very strong muscle besides the skeletal muscle in the human system. The cardiac muscle is myogenic. The word myogenic has to be remembered here because the cardiac muscle can contract and relax rhythmically without a brain stimulus, meaning a nerve stimulus from the brain is not needed to initiate the pumping of the heart, thanks to the myogenicity of the cardiac muscle. Next, the human heart is purely located in between the lungs in the thoracic cavity. However, it is slightly tilted to the left, Hence, it is not symmetrically in the middle of the thoracic cavity. And it is covered by a very thick pericardium. Hence, it gives the durability and the resistance for the extensive pumping of the heart. Now, let us take a look at this diagram. You will see that the oxygenated blood comes through the left atrium and the left ventricle. The left ventricle pumps the oxygenated blood to the aorta, where the aorta distributes the oxygenated blood to all parts of the body. While the blue arrows indicate the deoxygenated blood, which are received by the right atrium from the anterior vena cava and the posterior vena cava. The right ventricle then pumps the deoxygenated blood through the pulmonary artery back to the lungs to get it oxygenated. Now we're going to take a look at the cross-sectional analysis that will show us the various compartments of the human heart. But before we take a look at the cross-sectional diagram, let us have a brief understanding on the compartments, and we'll take a look at it at the board. Before we take a look at the cross-sectional diagram in the slides, I wanted to show you all the various compartments of the human heart. The human heart has 4 major quadrants, as it's labeled here. This is the first quadrant, which is termed as the right atrium, and this is the second quadrant, which is termed as the right ventricle. This is the left atrium and left ventricle. So there are 2 atrias. Why atrias? The plural form for the word atrium is atria, as written here. So the human heart has got 2 atrias and 2 ventricles. So there are 4 quadrants, 4 compartments in the human heart. Now we're going to take a look at the 3-dimensional description in the slide. Now this diagram, of course, it is much more colorful and it is much more clearer compared to the representation on the blackboard. Now let us take a look at the first quadrant, which is the right atrium. See that it is opened to the arterial vena cava as well as the posterior vena cava. Arterial vena cava and posterior vena cava brings back deoxygenated blood from all parts of the body. Hence, deoxygenated blood is drained into the right atrium. Now, the right atrium is actually separated from the right ventricle, and if you can see here, there is a valve structure. This valve is named as the tricuspid valve. It is an atrioventricular valve. The right atrium, once it contracts, pushes open the valve, hence enabling the blood to be pumped into the right ventricle. Once the right ventricle is filled with deoxygenated blood, the tricuspid valve closes. And if you take a look up here, there is a semilunar valve at the base of the pulmonary artery. Once the blood is filled in the right ventricle, the semilunar valve opens, thus enabling the pumping of blood from the right ventricle into the pulmonary artery to be returned to the lungs. Now, an important feature that you have to notice here is the wall of the right atrium is much thinner compared to the wall of the right ventricle. The reason is very simple. The right atrium only needs to pump blood into the right ventricle, whereas the right ventricle has to give a little more force so that the blood can be pumped into the lungs. Hence, the thicker wall of the right ventricle. Now, let us take a look at the diagram again. There is a separation in between the right atrium and right ventricle with the left atrium and the left ventricle. It is separated by a wall of muscle called the septum. Now let us take a look at the left atrium and left ventricle. The left atrium receives blood from the pulmonary vein. The pulmonary vein brings oxygenated blood from the lungs and it drains into the left atrium. Okay, now let us take a look at the left atrium and left ventricle. The left atrium receives oxygenated blood from the lungs to the pulmonary vein. Once the left atrium is filled with oxygenated blood, it opens up into the left ventricle through the bicuspid valve opening. The bicuspid valve is also called as the mitral valve. Once the left ventricle is filled with oxygenated blood, this blood is pumped into the aorta by the opening of the semilunar valve, and thus oxygenated blood can be supplied to all parts of the body. Dear students, was that overwhelming? It will be repeated in the upcoming slides. Okay, now let us take a look at the structure of the cardiac muscle. Now, this is a very simple representation of the cardiac muscle fiber. The cardiac muscle, as it was mentioned earlier, it is myogenic. Myogenic meaning that it does not need a brain stimulus or a nerve stimulus to initiate the contraction or the relaxation of the cardiac muscles. The reason the cardiac muscle fiber is capable of being myogenic is due to its presence of many intercalated discs, whereby the muscle contraction can be synchronized. Now let us take a deeper look at the internal structure of the human heart. As for a reflection, let me go through it again with the compartments. The human heart has 2 atria and 2 ventricles. It receives deoxygenated blood from the anterior vena cava and the posterior vena cava into the right atrium and right ventricle. Contraction of the right atrium and the right ventricle enables the blood to be pumped through the pulmonary artery back to the lungs. Well, the left atrium and the left ventricle, they receive oxygenated blood from the lungs via the pulmonary vein, and the contraction of the right ventricle enables the blood to be pumped through the aorta to all parts of the body. Now, let us take a closer look at the 2 valves that are involved here. First is the atrioventricular valve, which is the tricuspid valve and the bicuspid valve. For that, we'll have to go to the board. Right, the tricuspid valve is between the right atrium and the right ventricle. Once the blood is drawn into the right atrium from the anterior vena cava, and the posterior vena cava. Once the right atrium is filled with deoxygenated blood from the anterior vena cava and the posterior vena cava, the tricuspid valve opens, thus enabling the flow of blood from the right atrium into the right ventricle. Likewise, the bicuspid valve, which is in between the left atrium and the left ventricle, opens when the left atrium is filled with blood. Both these valves are called as atrioventricular valves. Another name for the bicuspid valve is the mitral valve. Now we're going to take a look at another set of valves. They are called as semilunar valves. Let us go back to the diagram as shown on the slide. Now let us take a look at the semilunar valves. There are 2 semilunar valves, one in the base of the aorta and one at the base of the pulmonary artery. Both these valves play a very important role in avoiding the backflow of blood. Both these valves open when the right ventricle and the left ventricle contract respectively, thus pumping blood back into the lungs through the pulmonary artery and blood through all parts of the body through the aorta. With that, we have had a clear description about the function of the atrioventricular valves and the semilunar valves. Now, a very important question rises here as to why the left ventricle wall is thicker than the right ventricle wall. Any ideas, students? So I hope, dear students, that you all have got a clear picture on the direction of blood flow through the heart chambers. And that concludes the circulation through the heart. Now let us take a look as to how the heart initiates the contraction and relaxation that enables the pump to function. Now the next part of the lesson, we are going to take a look at how the heart can initiate its own contraction and relaxation. We have mentioned to you earlier that the heart is a myogenic muscle, hence it does not require stimulus from the brain. Now we're going to take a look at what actually initiates the stimulus within the heart. There is a node called the Sinoatrial Node, which is located at the base of the anterior vena cava in the right atrium. And there is another node which is between the right atrium and the right ventricle. Both these nodes play a very important role in stimulating or in initiating the impulse that is passed and generated throughout the muscles that enables the muscle to contract. Now let us take a look at that. The Sinoatrial Node is a small patch of specialized tissue located in the wall of the right atrium near the entrance to the anterior vena cava. It acts as a pacemaker for the rest of the heart to control the rate and rhythm of the beating of the heart. In this diagram, you can see the location of the Sinoatrial Node and the location of the atrioventricular node. Now let us see the sequence of events that leads to the contraction of the heart muscles. The sinoatrial node generates a wave of excitatory impulses. These impulses spread to both atria, causing them to contract simultaneously, thus forcing the blood into the ventricles. The impulse then moves to the AV node or the atrioventricular node, and this stimulates the AV node. Impulses transmitted from the AV node travel along the bundle of hairs and its branches and are rapidly transmitted to the apex of the heart and up the network of Purkinje fibers in the ventricles. This causes the ventricles to contract simultaneously and spread upwards from the bottom. Thus, the blood is forced upwards into the aorta and pulmonary artery. My dear students, have you ever wondered what is it like to have a pacemaker transplant? A person who has a pacemaker transplant does not have a functioning AV node. Hence, the presence of the pacemaker at the surface of the skin enables the triggering and the transmission of impulse into the heart. Hence, the role of the AV node is taken over by the artificially implanted pacemaker. Now let us take a look at what a cardiac cycle is all about. Now, the cardiac cycle is a sequence of events that occurs during one complete heartbeat. It consists of two phases, the diastolic phase and the systolic phase. Dear students, what is the resting blood pressure of a normal human being? Yes, you're right. It is about 120 and 80 millimeter mercury. The 120 refers to the systolic phase, the systolic count, while the 80 refers to the diastolic count. So what does diastolic phase and what does systolic phase mean? The diastolic phase is when the atria and the ventricles are relaxed, means they are being filled up with blood. The systolic phase is when the atria and ventricles contract. It is the phase where the heart is contracting to pump the blood to the aorta and the pulmonary artery. If you take a look, the sequence of events in a cardiac cycle in this diagram, you can see as the arrows are pointing that the blood is flowing through the right atrium into the right ventricle, as well in the left atrium and the left ventricle, and the semilunar valves are closed while this process of filling up is taking place. During the systolic phase, the atria and the ventricle contracts, hence the semilunar valves will open and the bicuspid and the tricuspid valves close. This then leads to the diastolic phase, where finally the atria and ventricles relax. The whole cycle only takes about 0.8 seconds. Now, have you wondered how does the blood flow through the vein? The vein does not contract like the arteries. And how does the vein return the blood back to the heart? The vein is capable of returning the blood back to the heart purely because of the work of skeletal muscles around the veins. The contraction of skeletal muscles eliminates any difficulty against gravity where the blood has to flow. The contraction of the skeletal muscles enables the veins to push and to forward the blood back to the heart. It can be seen in this diagram. The contraction of the skeletal muscle causes pressure on the vein, hence the valves which are along the veins, which are called as the pocket valves, open up, thus enabling the blood to flow towards the heart. My dear students, with that, we have covered the whole circulation process through the human heart and the various valves that are involved in enabling this human heart to pump efficiently and rhythmically. In order to recap all the understanding that we have had in today's lesson, let us do some questions. Question number 1. Which of the following is not part of the human heart? Choices are A. Left ventricle, B. Septum, C. Right atrium, and D. Nephron. I'm sure this was easy. Of course, the answer is D. Nephron. The nephron is a structure in the kidney and not part of the heart. Question number 2. During the contraction of the human heart, the highest pressure is developed in the A. Left atrium, B. Right atrium, C. Left ventricle, D. Right ventricle. Dear students, the atrium develops much less pressure compared to the ventricles because the walls of the atrium are thinner. And between the left ventricle and the right ventricle, the left ventricle wall is thicker. Hence, it creates a higher pressure compared to the right ventricle. Hence, the answer is none other than C, left ventricle. Now let us take a look at question number 3. Which valve is located between the right atrium and the right ventricle? This is a very easy one. And the choices are bicuspid valve, B. Tricuspid valve, C. Semilunar valve, and D. All valves. Yes, you're right. The answer is B. Tricuspid valve. Question number 4. Oxygenated blood returns to the heart through the A. Aorta, B. Vena cava, C. Pulmonary vein, and D. Pulmonary artery. Oxygenated blood returns to the heart through the pulmonary vein. C. The answer is C. Pulmonary vein. Now let us take a look at aorta. Aorta carries oxygenated blood from the heart to all parts of the body, while vena cava returns deoxygenated blood from all parts of the body to the heart. Pulmonary artery drains away deoxygenated blood from the heart to the lungs. So the answer is none other than C. Now let us do this mastery test 5. The wall of the left ventricle is thicker and more muscular than the wall of the right ventricle, and the walls of the ventricles are thicker than those of the atria. Suggest reasons for these differences. Okay, dear students, I think I made it very clear in the earlier part of the lesson that the atria has got a much thinner wall owing to the fact that it only has to pump the blood to the ventricle, while the ventricles have to pump the blood back to the lungs or through the aorta to all parts of the body. As for the right ventricle, it only has to pump the blood to the lungs, while the left ventricle has to pump the blood to all parts of the body. Hence, the left ventricle has got the thickest or the more thicker wall compared to all the other compartments. Next, we are going to see question number 2. Does the beating of heart need to be stimulated by nerve impulses? Explain your answer. Many times I have repeated throughout this lesson that the heart is a myogenic organ. Hence, it does not require a nerve impulse from the brain. It is due to the stimulation by the Sinoatrial Node and the atrioventricular node that the heart is capable of sustaining its rhythmic contraction and relaxation. Question number 3. State 3 factors that can affect the rate of the heartbeat. Okay, this is a very interesting question. Let us take a look at what can really affect the rate of the heartbeat. The heart is innervated both by sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. When you are suddenly triggered by fear or anger or irritation, your heart has got a higher heart rate or a faster heartbeat. This is because of the sympathetic nervous system and the increase in adrenaline. Now, besides an emotional status which can trigger stress, excitement, fright and anger, physical activities can also increase the rate of heart rate owing to the presence of elevated levels of endorphin hormones. Besides, an increase in body temperature can also increase heart rate. So we have covered that the 3 factors that can affect the heart rate or the heartbeat are the emotional conditions, physical activities and body temperature. My dear students, with those questions and the explanations provided, I hope you had a better understanding of today's lesson. With the conclusion of that topic, we have reached the end of the systemic circulation system. Till we meet again in the next lesson, I'm Dr. Meena signing off from iTTV.